Christopher, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jamie.
It's go time for energy storage. With stress on the grid continuing to increase, we have predictions that demands will double by 2050 in the USA. As a result, we're seeing a lot of movement in the energy storage markets. So I was keen to welcome a true veteran in the field, Christopher Johnson, to clear up some misconceptions, answer our community questions, and give us some real insight into the future of energy storage. We hope you enjoy. Well, let's before getting to the myths and facts section, give us a quick introduction into you.
Great, thanks. And thanks again for having me. I'm Christopher Johnson, founder of Avanza Energy, and I have been in the energy storage space for about 8 years now. Most of my career as a founder or executive of a variety of startups across software, hardware, SaaS, data analytics, project development. So I've had a nice sampling on the kind of deployment and solution side of the industry, and now working to help expand and accelerate deployments of energy storage in US and Latin America.
When we first spoke, we talked about your background in with microgrids. You've got a rich history of scaling businesses as well. So I'm sure there's a lot that our audience will take away from this episode, obviously focusing all on energy storage. So first of all, really broad, but what's your assessment on the energy storage industry right now?
Well, I think it's now at a point where we could call it a mature industry. When I started in it about 8 years ago, I felt like we were still trying to prove ourselves and that the technology could be counted on, even though it really was already reliable. But now you see by the types of investments that are coming in, the type of financing that these projects are getting, and the scale that we're deploying at, we're really in a state of, one might say exponential growth will be a little bit curbed this year, but, taper with that also uncertainty. At least in the US market, tariffs are definitely disrupting, ability to plan and some of the supply chain issues. But really, the demand is there and the solutions are there, and it's go time.
I'm looking forward to hearing a bit more about the Latin American markets as well. And we obviously talked a lot about your time in Cordoba, Argentina as well, where you spent some good time there. But let's get into the myths and facts section on energy storage. So the first one is, to advance energy storage, we need to wait until the next battery technology.
I think there's always a shiny object syndrome distraction when it comes to technology, and people are thinking, oh, we need a cheaper solution or the longer duration solution or the new chemistry. But honestly, we already have price points where and scale of production where we have solutions today. Now, we do need everything. We still need the new technologies and the new solutions, especially the longer duration that are coming, but that should not stop us from taking action and deploying today.
So I guess from an advancement perspective, it's not necessarily a technology gap. Is it more of a commercialization gap? Or
I think we still have an awareness and education gap. I mean, Omri Levins has I think it's a TED talk from something like 10 years ago where he says the same thing. He's like, oh, do we need to wait for a new battery solution? He's like, no. And at that point, a lot of what we needed was more on the software side of things. But I do think, we have the challenge in the US market is we have 3,000 utilities and 3,000 counties, more or less. Every one of those is a different rate structure, a different regulator, a different AHJ who's approving these things. And that really slows down deployment. So there's just still a lack of understanding in these. And then, you get a little bit of like, we had here in California, we had the Moss Landing fire a couple months back. That was, both a chemistry that's not so common anymore for stationary storage, as well as a way of building battery systems that's not so common anymore. And so educating people about what is the state of the art and the safe way that we do things now that's really changed is important for the well-being and the adoption across the industry.
The next one is, we don't need energy storage if we just build more renewables.
Well, I mean, that's kind of, definitely the opposite of that is true, right? The more renewables the more energy storage is needed. So essentially, we already have, I think there's about 7 countries in Europe and various markets in the US where prices go negative during the day on the wholesale energy market because there's an excess of energy. Now, that just means then that there's curtailment of that energy. It's literally just wasted. So that's from wind and solar. Now, if you have batteries that can soak up that excess energy when it's really cheap and then deploy it when it's needed in the evening, that helps with, what we typically see in markets where renewable penetration is more mature. They're called the duck curve, where, in the mornings and the evenings are the most stressful period on the grid. And that's the time when there's the least solar. And so batteries are able to help deploy energy during those times, as well as capture value in the market.
Interesting one on gas peaker plants, which I know you can talk to. So we will continue to depend on gas peaker plants and utility scale deployments to balance the grid.
In the US, we're in a period of load growth for the first time in about 20 plus years. And this was already starting before everybody started freaking out about data centers. So with the move towards electrification, first really leading with transportation, EVs were driving the need for load growth, as well as investments in the distribution grid to handle the increased load at the edge, right? At the where we're actually consuming power. Now, these peaker plants are often, sort of from the old school utility model, right? Big things located far away. So that requires transmission infrastructure to bring that to you. So whether that's coming from large scale solar or renewable projects or a gas turbine, you still have to have that transmission infrastructure. It's really hard to build transmission infrastructure in this country. We're way behind on doing it. So yes, we'll need some more transmission infrastructure. Right now, if you wanted to build a new gas power plant, the wait time to get a turbine is over 5 years. So we also have the issue that renewables are faster to deploy. There's still issues with interconnection queues. So in general, we have a lot of challenges on growing the grid. Some estimates say we need to double the grid by 2050. And so there's just a ton of opportunity. We kind of need everything, right? We need the distributed level. We also need the large scale systems. And that's both on energy storage and on the renewable side.
Why did it take 5 years?
Well, there's not a lot of manufacturers and they're very back ordered, right? So limited production capacity. And this is where the data center demand is really messing up the market, right? So a lot of these data centers are moving to a on-site generation strategy, and so people are ordering 100 plus megawatts of generation capacity. Luckily, there are some folks looking at doing that with some solar and battery to supplement that, because it can actually lower the energy cost. But it's speed is the name of the game in the data center race right now.
Yeah, it's an interesting point about talk. Do we need to double or demand will double on the grid by 2050? What, in your opinion, is driving that? What trends or applications? Is it data centers, or do you see other factors at play?
So we have really, with the evolution of technology, we're moving towards more electrification, right? Electric vehicles are a better driving experience, and so they're starting to replace ICE vehicles because they're better, right? Now that's taking something that and you see this across the home, right? So now we have induction stoves are starting to replace gas stoves as what chefs prefer for the best cooking experience. Okay, that's a pretty big load. Those can be 15 kilowatts, right? Your vehicle, you're going to be charging that at 6 to 18 kilowatts in your home, probably, right? And then we also got heat pumps. Again, a amazing innovation in terms of efficiency of the technology, both for water heating and space conditioning. But those are big loads. Maybe you're talking about 60 kilowatts now. So that's a lot of load to add to a single home. And if you look at that happening across, what do we have, 100 million homes, something like that in the country, in buildings, then there's a lot of new load being generated there. The data center load, data centers, I think now is about 3 to 4% of overall load, and in the country, it's predicted to double. We're still only talking about like 8%. We also have onshoring of manufacturing and other industries that are just they're really trying to clean up some of the emissions issues. We have some they call hard to abate industries, right? So like steel, cement, things where it's like high heat requirements. Those are hard to decarbonize. But as they do, those are very large loads coming onto the electrical grid.
Just on the induction hob, my wife and I would disagree. We miss a gas hob massively since moving here to Spain. We've left behind a lovely gas hob and stove.
And you have induction there?
We've got induction here. Yeah, it just seems to be more of a thing. And we miss it dearly. But anyway, if that's what the chefs are saying, that's fine. We'll take their word for it. Nice. And two more myths or facts to clear up. First one, batteries are still too expensive for widespread adoption.
When I started in the industry, we were selling batteries at over $1,000 a kilowatt hour, and the price, and they would still pencil in a lot of situations, right? We're able to scale and grow a company at that prices, and now the scale of manufacturing has grown so much, and a lot of efficiencies there have brought the prices down a lot. Now we're again getting a little bit messed up right now in terms of tariffs as to like where the prices are actually coming in at. But even with the tariffs, and at the same time as those prices have come down, you look at what you're competing against with a battery, and that's usually the grid. And the utility prices have continued to go up. Where I'm at, they've gone up 70% in the last 4 years. And at the same time, there's increased reliability challenges with the grid. So you look at some of the big markets, like I'm in California, we have some of the most expensive electricity, and also the utilities will just turn it off at various times. So this is, the utility scale energy storage in California is huge. It's one of the largest markets, but also the residential deployments have been huge. And now finally, in the kind of segment that's been lagging has been the commercial and industrial. And the cost of disruption to business is so high now, and the technologies are readily available that those solutions are starting to get deployed at scale. So I think you have that bad service, right? Like reliability issues and cost issues combined with availability of the technology and the cost, the prices of it being much more competitive. We're seeing just massive adoption. And I think we're just at the beginning of it.
And the last one kind of related, especially with the tariffs at the moment. The last myth to clear up is LFP will continue to dominate the market.
Yeah, so lithium ferrous phosphate or lithium iron phosphate has become the dominant chemistry that's being used in stationary energy storage. And that's a great progression from where we started, where it was more the stuff coming out of electric vehicles was what was getting used, because that was where there was the scale in manufacturing. NMC, though, is much more volatile, much more subject to thermal runaway. And so, hence this, like the Moss Landing fire we had a few months ago. And so LFP is much safer, much more earth abundant, non-conflict minerals that are involved there. And so it's great that this has become the go-to. And so going forward, I think there's a couple things here. Yes, there are some new technologies and new chemistries coming out that I think are quite promising. But the name of the game in energy storage is scale of manufacturing. If you can't get to the scale of manufacturing, it doesn't matter. And so, I've seen some numerous long duration storage technologies promising quite low prices, and it's so hard for them to compete because the LFP system prices have come down so much in the recent years. And right now there's already essentially an overcapacity of production in LFP cells. China already has essentially enough capacity to meet the entire world demand, and has other factories in the making. So similar to what we've seen in the solar industry, there's going to be an oversupply issue. So the prices are, going to continue, crashing. There's going to be some consolidation in the industry. But there's basically going to be plenty of LFP, which is great for project development, for deployment, and for those people who want to adopt, because it should keep the prices fairly low.
So myth or fact, do you think it will continue to dominate, or do you think there's other players in the market?
I tell people it's like, a commercialization of a new technology in this space is a decade, right? So I think we've got at least 5 years where nothing's going to touch it, maybe close to 10, until something more competitive can come on, and that gives us plenty of room to deploy and grow.
That clears up the myths and facts section. We'll get into a bit more about you and kind of your matter of expertise. So first of all, talk us through the emergence of Avanza Energy. I know it's still a relatively young journey, and why you're so invested in the space.
Great. Yeah, thanks. I got started in this space about 8 years ago, and I really saw energy storage as the key to unlocking more renewable energy. And, renewables have come on as, especially solar and wind have come on as just the lowest cost and also carbon-free generation technology, right? We're seeing something like 95% of all new generation capacity in the US in the last year was renewable. And so, but at that point, energy storage was still quite new to being able to be integrated and adopted with it. And now we're at this point where it's last year, the amount of energy storage installed in the US equaled the entire amount of energy storage ever installed before in the US, right? So we're hitting this exponential growth point in the industry, and yet we are still at a tiny fraction of what we need to be doing, right? And not only is the technology key for integrating more renewable energy, which is helping people access the lowest cost electricity, it's also really important for grid stabilization, right? So just a couple of years ago, we were having rolling brownouts in California during the summer, during heat waves. And there has been about 10 gigawatt hours of energy storage deployed on the California grid. We didn't have any of those when we had the same heat wave last year. So it's already really helping to stabilize the grid, and we need more players in the space, right? We need more success, and we need more deployment, and we need more solutions. And so Avanza was created by some industry veterans who really said, what can we do to help those who want to get into the space? You know, as you and many of your viewers know, this is quite a rabbit hole. And if you're not deep in energy storage or in the energy space, to try and come in with a new solution and be successful in the market is really challenging. And so we're here to help people navigate that, both from the strategic side of things, figuring out the market opportunities, providing market intelligence, as well as the execution of solutions. So we have some deep expertise in the software space and really helping the players to integrate software solutions, new technologies like artificial intelligence. It can really boost how we're dealing with all of this data that's in the space and help with the success. And so we've really looked at both the US, which I would say is a fairly mature market in this, and Latin America, which has a lot of like kind of emerging market opportunities. So it's a very different like space and different strategies for both of those. But we're really, really excited to support those who, whether that's a manufacturer who wants to come into this space, a solution provider who's really looking to land or expand, or project developers and financiers who need some support navigating the energy storage markets. We're really excited to work with more folks who want to get into the space.
We talked a bit before about future demand on the grid and how that is going to continue to increase. In terms of advancing capacity and management of the grid, what do you think is more important? Do you think software or hardware is most important to get there?
You know, we're just in this all of the above moment, I think, for the grid. So I would say that in this space, the hardware is becoming increasingly commoditized, right? But you still have to deploy it, right? You can have the best software solution, but if you don't have anything to run it on, you don't have a business. And so deployment matters, and really getting that happening at scale and accelerating is very important for the grid's health. And now that's both at the utility scale side as well as the distributed side. At the distributed side, I think we're seeing more and more the need for software solutions around things like virtual power plants, or the aggregation of these distributed resources to turn them into a resource for the grid at scale. On the utility side, I would say a lot of the low-hanging fruit on project siting and economics has been taken. So you need more software to help make sure you make good decisions about where you're putting this, how are you operating it, so that you can capture the real value that you can get from the market.
Interesting. We've been seeing some movement in terms of investment and new businesses popping up, and just a lot of excitement around grid optimization. So organizations that are focusing on AI or machine learning or deep learning solutions, as opposed to the hardware side, as you mentioned, which potentially is becoming more commoditized. How are you viewing that kind of grid optimization space at the moment?
So over the last couple of years, so on the grid planning side, right, we've got our distribution, transmission, and generation broad buckets of investment. The distribution grid has been the largest source of investment over the last couple of years. And that's across a lot of different utilities across the whole country. And that's because we're really starting to strain the grid there. And if you look at the load growth demands, there is an argument to be made that the cheapest way, and also the fastest way, and maybe even the only way we can meet that, is by taking advantage of distributed resources on the distribution grid. And this is totally a software play, right? It's tons of data, real-time data, optimization, localized data, right? Because the challenge with like a gas peaker plant is it's like one thing far away, and it may be able to address a system peak, which would be your highest demand across the entire system at a given moment. but it can't address a feeder peak, right? So the actual distribution feeders that serve our homes and businesses, that's a very localized challenge. And this is where having very localized and targeted deployments and coordination of assets can provide a very cost-effective solution for the grid from a planning and investment perspective to meet like how we're needing to modernize the grid.
Yeah, it's definitely a really interesting space that we've been kind of moving into as of recent times. So yeah, I'm excited to see how that market develops. We talked before about you supporting companies in the US and Latin America. So difficult to answer this question because ultimately you need to know a little bit about me as a potential customer. But what would you say is your best advice when deploying products in these geographies?
First of all, this is a very much a relationship based, industry. So I think it's important to have a presence. I think it's very I've seen some companies who want to not have a presence here. They're maybe trying to do customer support from overseas, and that just doesn't really work here, right? You really need to be able to support your market, support your distribution channels, and to build relationships to the key folks who are actually deploying your product. So market presence here is important. Participation in the industry, right? Be aware of what our, the current trends are is important. We have a lot of different regulations that shape what is required of a given product to be deployed anywhere. And there are certain markets that kind of lead on the edge of those and other markets that follow. But it's not just because you have a great product doesn't mean you can actually even legally sell it here, right? So making sure that you're, complying with all of the standards that are required. And then also just make sure you're providing a unique solution, right? I think I've seen a number of startups try and create products without actually an awareness of the competitive landscape. And I think that's somewhere we can help as well. Just we're very familiar with a lot of the players and can help people kind of assess those and find where are the opportunities. I think there's a lot of opportunities still in specific application solutions. So, right, not just the general box or general software, but like what actually are you solving, right? A lot of the integration of energy storage with X, right? With home vehicle charging or just with EV, DC fast charging in general, right? Helping to where it can be used to really accelerate deployment and ease the both cost as well as strain on the grid.
Something we've not really talked about on the show is Latin America in depth, which is why I was really keen to bring you on board. Where do you see the biggest opportunities in Latin America when it comes to energy storage? And I understand you've been keeping a key eye on the Caribbean as well, or the Caribbean, should we say?
Well, certainly on island economies, you often find very high energy prices. And there's still a number of places across the Caribbean where, you're dependent on diesel gensets. And so solar plus battery or renewable plus battery, even with a backup generator, can be much more cost effective. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities to displace very expensive and, carbon intense energy in the islands. There's also reliability issues, right? So a lot of the in my last company, we were based in Hawaii, which has enormous solar adoption at the time, was one of the leading markets. And but after Hurricane Maria in 2017 just clobbered Puerto Rico, we began doing a lot of work on the rebuilding with resilience on the island. So providing that, providing real like microgrid solutions, I think is, they're more complex, they're more costly than just providing some grid supporting batteries, but they really are a solution who's needed today, right? With our increasing extreme climate events, they're able to actually provide critical infrastructure, especially reliability and ability to ride through some of these storms, to provide services to their community. And so, but I mean, we see this like various parts of Mexico is emerging also as a strong market with energy storage, also has reliability issues. And so you don't even need like necessarily the like, we in the US we have more of a mature like incentive structure and tax credits and things like that, which have really helped accelerate that. But in some of these markets, you don't need that, right? If you can provide a reliable solution, you can displace like the use of the grid, and essentially it's grid defection in a way, or using the grid as backup is becoming how folks are having doing this, and then and even enabling development in areas that don't have a grid. Right. And again, that applies in the US as well, but even more so in some of these Latin American markets.
And the final question before we move into questions from the community, you've actually got four questions to cover. So the last one, nice and well, it's not easy, a bit broad. So how do you see the energy storage world developing over the next 5 years?
Well, like I said earlier, I think we're not doing enough, and we're just at the point where we're starting to hit the growth that we really need to see. And I think what's really holding us back is a fair remuneration for what the batteries are providing to the grid. So there's a lot of places where there is no market mechanism, or the market participation is inhibited. So we're not able to capture the full value that we're providing to the grid. And if we're able to unlock that and unlock it at scale, and there are some organizations that are working on trying to like have a more uniform approach across these different regulatory bodies and across these different markets, if we're able to unlock the value capture for energy storage, this market will just will be 10x in 5 years. And so I think we're going to really see also in the next 5 years, we should see pretty much, well, again, asterisks, tariffs are messing a little bit of these calculations up, but like home batteries should pencil in almost every state within the next 5 years. And so right now it's just been dominated in a few markets, right? Like every market across the US is deploying batteries, and but there's certain states that are the majority of those deployments. There's going to be a lot more markets where it's making sense. And that's as utility prices continue to rise and the scale in this industry continues to lower the cost. We also, even though there are a lot of battery deployments, I think there are still a lot of inefficiencies in terms of soft costs that are come into projects. So as the market matures, as we're able to standardize some of these deployments in these different markets, that should bring down costs even more. And hopefully this will help with some of our challenges around labor force, right? Because right now there's just, we're short electricians in general across the whole country, right? So, and those who have familiarity with batteries is a small data set, smaller pool. So we really need to grow our labor force for this as well. And so some of the standardization around solutions will help to do that as well.
You mentioned earlier you describe it as a mature market, but it's still so dynamic, which is exciting, and why that question is so difficult to answer, because there's a lot that's going to happen in the next 5 years. So,
and we're very dependent on the regulatory system in the US especially, right? I mean, if you look at the PJM market, which is in like the northeast of the country, was one of the earliest places where energy storage was deployed at scale. And that was because they had a fairly lucrative frequency regulation market there. And so batteries were helping to stabilize the grid with frequency regulation. And in 2017, they just killed it. And they just in like hundreds of megawatts of batteries were decommissioned because the market evaporated. And so we need a stable like landscape within this. And I feel like having a vision and a what are we moving towards in terms of what we want for our grid is important. And we haven't been great at that in the US because we don't have a national grid. Right. We have all these different regulatory bodies and different markets that it's been, in 3 separate grids, sort of separate. And so really, if we can agree on where are we going and how do we want to invest to get there, energy storage is a major part of the solution. And so there's just tons of opportunities, but we need advocacy and action at all levels, right? At the regulatory level, at the policy level, at the state level, at the national level. And really being able to, and have solutions that are viable to and able to be deployed with the workforce, with the technology, with the financing. So, it's mature, but we're still not where we should be, right? We still have, I like to say that pretty much anybody working on a climate solution today is probably doing like 100th or 1,000th of what they could be doing and what we need them to be doing.
Super interesting, because that brings on to the questions from the community, the final section, and regulatory concerns have been mentioned a couple of times. So the first question from the community is, Are federal and state regulations outdated when it comes to enabling decentralized storage and microgrids?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, microgrids are their own complex issue here. And this, I would say, we have the whole way in which we've conceived of the utility in monopoly in general is very outdated. And that is directly getting in the way of microgrid progress, right? So there's, basically we grant the utility a monopoly for a particular market, and that comes down, boils down to a very simple thing: is like you can't cross a road with a wire, because that violates this monopoly we've granted. And so that really is, I mean, whereas like you could see microgrids could be serving entire neighborhoods, entire like sections of the grid, but it's at conflict with how we're treating the monopoly utility. So that, I think, is like one of the key things we need to address. We have a massive inefficiency in terms of regulation. Most of the regulators are under-resourced, understaffed, and they're trying to wrap their head around all these emerging technologies. They're doing it all in very various ways, right? They're independently. So we haven't really got like and again, there are some organizations that are doing good work to try and streamline this and bring it up to best practices. But we could be going much faster in that regard. And then at the federal level, I mean, we're in this right now. I think the biggest thing in play is the potential loss of the investment tax credit, which was part of the current federal budget negotiations that is potentially going to happen. Personally, I think we need to be moving the industry to one that does not depend on subsidies. And I think we need to, and I think the subsidies, let's just remove subsidies across all the industries and, and see who competes. Because frankly, with, the costs have come down enough and the renewable energy is so cheap these days that these pencils will still these solutions will still pencil. We just need stability in the market to be able to like just adapt the business models and the deployment.
The next one is, who should own the future of grid storage? You might have touched on that a little bit there. Utilities, private companies, communities, or the government?
Well, this is can be its own, I would say, rather deep debate. But essentially, part of the way this relationship with the utility has emerged is the utility is not supposed to have any control on the customer side of the meter. So from that regard, I think customers should be able to control their assets and use them how they want. And if the utility wants access to those, there needs to be a fair agreement, and there needs to be like a consenting agreement, right? So the emergence of these meter collars as a technology, which is becoming somewhat standardized as a way to interconnect different energy assets, is a little bit of a gray zone, because oftentimes the utility control is built into those devices. And so if the customer, and a lot of customers, they don't know this, right? Like we're in this phase of the market where people didn't want to think about electricity for a long time, right? They want to turn on a light switch and things work. And now it's getting more complex, right? As you try and, install a device and you're told you don't have enough room in your panel, and now you have to upgrade. And then now you can't even upgrade your panel without the service transformer down the street getting upgraded. And then now you're waiting a year. I mean, it's like everything has become a lot more like people are forced to learn more. And so currently customers don't know to ask for these things. They don't know to ask for the access to their data. They don't know how to, about these control and the options of what they could be doing. And that customers, in part, like, I don't think the utilities want us to, because like these solutions are now able to provide primary power, right? We are able to effectively defect from the grid and operate our own microgrids at a cost-effective solution, like that is better quality power and lower cost than some of these centralized grids. And utilities really don't want us to think and talk too much about that, right? And so, I do think there are, now the role of aggregators is kind of like in terms of when we talk about like virtual power plants, who's going to actually enroll customers to participate in some kind of market scheme where they get remunerated. They have some kind of reward for participating, and the utility can kind of coordinate its requests with the aggregator, who then turns those assets into a real resource for the grid. So I think, I definitely am cautious about extending utility control over assets, right? In a lot of markets in the U.S., where we've deregulated, we basically forbidding the utility from owning certain types of assets, right? Um, and so giving them back some of these assets seems like kind of contradictory, right? They're not showing themselves as very efficient users of capital in deploying this. They're great at spending money, but not necessarily cost effectively, I don't think. And so I think we need to have, we also have, if you look at like the ownership of utility scale energy storage systems, about 5 years ago, 75% of the assets were owned by the top 10 um, owners. And this year, it's projected to be 15%. So there are a ton of new owners who are coming in and investing in these spaces. This is one of the reasons I say this is a more mature market. Lots of capital is coming in, and not folks who are deeply steeped in energy storage, but they see this as a good investment opportunity, right? And so I think we need to be, have these opportunities, right, where folks can own these assets and operate them for a long term. And with the markets functioning, they can make money and they support the grid.
The next one is, I kind of get where this person's coming from, but as we discussed before, electrification is just going to put more and more demand on the grid. But this person has asked, should we be focusing more on reducing energy demand rather than trying to store excess?
Well, I mean, it used to be, whenever you're doing a renewable installation, you start with energy efficiency, right? Like make sure you can, change your light bulbs and stuff like that. But now we're at this point where like we are electrifying things, right? And so we're actually increasing the load. So when you're doing that planning, you're not just thinking about like, am I meeting today's needs, but I have to plan for, I want to upgrade, to a heat pump. I want to get an electric vehicle, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, I think we have made huge strides in again in the U.S. I think there are a lot of opportunities in some of these Latin American markets for greater energy efficiency improvements. We're just in a point where we're going to need a lot more electricity, and personally, I think every new industry that comes on should come on as a carbon neutral industry. Unfortunately, there's no regulation to enforce that, right? So all the Bitcoin mining is coming on, all of the data center growth that's happening, like they're going to need electricity somewhere. And even with our onshoring of industries, this is driving huge demands for electricity. So I think rather than energy efficiency, I would say the leveraging the assets at the edge, the distributed energy resources that are connected on the distribution grid, that's probably going to be our way that we can alleviate some of the strain on the grid that the increased load is causing, and provide a pretty effective way, cost-effective way for doing that. We still lack some of the market mechanisms and just uniform adoption, but that is happening, and it needs to happen a lot more.
So the final question from the community is, what is the role energy storage plays in replacing peaker plants and reducing emissions? I believe you might have touched on this earlier.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, peaker plants are, only operated a tiny fraction of the time they could be, right? So they're very expensive resources to operate. And so they help typically when you're having like a system peak, right? So hot summer day when everyone's running their air conditioning, and it helps, the grid deal with those few hours a year where it's really stressful. And these are something that like they can help with that system peak, but as I mentioned earlier, they can't help with a feeder peak, a distribution level peak, because they're not localized in how they can be deployed. Energy storage can be deployed at any of these scales, right? We have utility scale batteries that help with, for instance, like helping prevent some of these like brownouts we used to have in California just during the summer. But also you could have targeted feeder level deployments. And, you see this like essentially large batteries on wheels, right? Like electric vehicles are starting to be used as coordinated assets for grid operators as well. And, energy storage the deployment is still quite small. But we see, for instance, with, the folks like Home Connect or now Renew Home, they're aggregating thermal load, right? So smart thermostats, they're aggregating a gigawatt of capacity in Texas. And so you can imagine that. Now that's because, we have those smart thermostats are deployed at scale. As energy storage starts to get to scale, it will be a much more meaningful number to be operating and supporting the grid. We just need tons more. So that's why we need so many more people in the space, bringing the solutions and helping to deploy it.
Very well navigated. That's all the questions from the community. Just got one more, which is from a former guest, and I must compliment this former guest. It's a really interesting question. They have asked, so for an aspiring CEO, what 3 books would you recommend that they read?
Well, in this space, definitely say Gretchen Bake's The Grid, an excellent history of the grid and how we've ended up with, this utility mess that we have today. Let's see, for inspiring CEO, I'm a big fan of Measure What Matters, just kind of, gave rise to the objectives and key results framework. Very simple, I think incredibly powerful way of learning how to prioritize and navigate when you've got so much on your plate, which CEOs do. And then let's see, I think just to kind of mix up the flavors for this aspiring CEO, I think you got to check out some Brene Brown. Do some work on empathy and compassion and being like a more human leader, because this is where like I feel like we, at least in the kind of areas here, we give not enough priority to how leaders build company culture. And for companies to really be lasting, meaningful institutions, you need a healthy company culture and you need to support people's well-being. So Brene Brown's got some great work on that. And I think that would be a nice little set for the aspiring CEO.
Well, Christopher, thanks very much. We've gone into subjects that we haven't discussed before. So thank you very much and good luck. I know that the journey is still fairly young for you and Avanza, but good luck on trying to improve energy storage for us over the next kind of 5-10 years or more.
Thank you. Yeah, we've seen a lot of interest in the space and really working on both sharing more knowledge through things like our Substack and website. And so we really, and also doing events where we can bring the community together and highlight some of what's going on across the different aspects of the industry. So really appreciate you and the podcast and really helping to get more content out there for the community. So thanks to you, Gene.
Our pleasure. Really appreciate it. Thanks again, Christopher. Take care.
Thank you. You too.